Here to ask you, what is your most heartfelt concern? What issue concerns you the most? We've heard about a couple of issues. There are so many more. Education, prison reform, healthcare. Every day there's a new issue. Didn't used to be an issue, and it is today. So think about your issue, and then think about what is the biggest obstacle to getting that issue resolved. Why aren't we making headway? Move to Amend believes the reason we're not making any headway really is the influence of corporate money. And when I say corporate, I mean any artificial entity. Our lawmakers are bought. So we believe Move to Amend has the solution. We believe Move to Amend in itself is not so much an issue as an answer to other issues. So that's what we're going to be talking about. Deb's going to come up and tell you a little bit about our speaker, and then Jessica will start her presentation.
I come in after Deb.
Okay, that was Karen Galloway, thank you. And Dick Galloway, you're up next. Thanks everyone for coming. My name is Deborah Schreck, and I am here to tell you a little bit about our speaker. She is the National Program Director for Move to Amend. She flew in, I believe, Friday night or so into Ohio, and she's in from California. So to tell you a little bit about her, Jessica has worked with Move to Amend since 2014. She's responsible for a variety of programs and organizational partnerships and supervises the National Intern Program. She sits on the Outreach and Engagement, Political Organizing, and Grassroots Movement Committees, and chairs the Arts and Culture and Educators Caucuses. Whew, busy lady. Jessica first came to the democracy movement through her work in LGBTQ activism and organizing. She is impassioned by the work of building a strong and empowered democratic or democracy movement rooted in gender justice and dismantling white supremacy. She studied at Humboldt State University in Northern California with a major in political science with an emphasis in globalization, and spent a semester at Christ College in Bangalore, India. Her undergraduate research focused on women in the Indian democratic system and LGBTQ voters. She served as the Western Region Policy Coordinator for the Roosevelt Institute Campus Network and was the Assistant Director of a nonprofit ballroom dance studio before coming to Move to Amend. She's a proud member of the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom and an organizer with the campaign to abolish statutes of limitations for sexual assault. Please welcome me before Jessica. Welcome me in welcoming Dick Galloway for a quick announcement.
We didn't get the schedule down perfectly, as you might have noticed. Okay, everybody, show me your money. You don't have any? What happened? No, don't go get one. I want to see your money. Hold on. Boy, I tell you what, okay, we've got a couple now. Tell me, Carol, tell me, what is the denomination of that money?
Holy moly. Is that, let me see. Yeah, let me see. 1 million.
1 million. Now, let's pretend, I'm going to pretend like you are my candidate for Congress. No, you are my candidate. Now, if I give you that $1 million bill, can I buy your vote?
Heck yeah.
Oh my goodness. Do we have to tell anyone?
Yeah. So you do know that when people can throw that kind of money at a politician, they can get something in return, even if it can't be proved in court. The top 400 people in the nation have, after tax, $67 million after tax in their pocket. That was back in '09. It's gone up a lot. Okay? Now think about it just for a second. If I had $67 million, I think, boy, I wonder if I could live on $17.5 million this year. You think you could? Okay, so think about that. So if I live on $17.5 million, I got $50 million left in my pocket. Okay? What is $50 million worth? $1 million for every congressman in the House, U.S. House. Okay? That's important to understand. That's the type of numbers that we're up against. That's the kind of power we're up against until we conquer this problem. So you have one can buy the House, a couple more can buy the Senate. That still leaves 396 to buy all the state governments. Okay, so just keep that in mind, and keep this in mind, that, and look at this one good. 80% of the American public say they want big money out of politics. That's where the people are. The politicians, and especially our progressive politicians, say the right thing. But when my phone rings, I turn it off. My thought was, somebody help me out.
The Democratic senators say the right thing, but then what happens?
But when it comes down to a vote on Big Pharma or on any one of the big issues, okay, they're going to vote where the money is. They know that if they don't vote in the direction that the people in that business are, they know they won't get any money again. So what we've got to do is say, look, politicians, candidates, you need to listen to us, because if you, this is where the people are, okay? Get out in front of the people and you will turn the state from red to blue. I really believe that. Give it some thought. And now I will say, Jessica, our newfound friend, come on up. We have been delighted to be her host family. She is a wonderful, wonderful person. Thank you for coming.
Thank you for having me. Thank you so much for being here tonight. I know there's a lot competing with this event. There's a debate and lots of other stuff going on, so thank you for choosing to be here. I don't know if I've ever felt so pastor-like right now. This is great. Okay, so first of all, how many of you knew about Move to Amend's work before tonight? Okay, cool, great. So I want to start off by a very simple description of Move to Amend, what we're doing, and then we'll get into a very quick history lesson tonight. And then what we're going to do is try to interact with each other a little bit and do a timeline exercise so we can figure out how the heck we ended up in a situation where corporations are people and money is speech. Because I don't know about you, but it feels like the Twilight Zone. So let's figure it out. So Move to Amend is a national grassroots organization that is working to amend the United States Constitution to abolish corporate constitutional rights and money as speech. So I came to this work, as Deb said, through my work with an LGBTQ organization, and I was planning a pride parade in my hometown, and I noticed that Wells Fargo was one of our pride sponsors. And I thought, well, that's interesting, because I just read that Wells Fargo donated something like $250,000 to an anti-LGBT candidate. That doesn't quite seem like allyship to me, but they have all of these rainbow stickers. So I'm going to investigate that a little bit. And I became really interested in corporate culture first. I didn't start out from the legal side, I started out from the cultural side, and seeing how corporations have co-opted our culture and also our movements. I've seen how Wells Fargo and Smirnoff and other brands that are directly contributing to the incarceration and disenfranchisement of marginalized people are somehow sponsoring our events and our movement, and that really bothers me. So that's when I found Move to Amend, and I found that Move to Amend had an analysis that matched my personality, because I don't like to waste my time. I think of myself as a pretty efficient person. And I've done a lot of activism that has felt like hacking at the branches of a big tree that was diseased, and we're always trying to do the work on a daily basis to fix our problems. But then we can look down and we can see that the roots of this tree are gnarled and diseased, and the roots of this tree are corporate power. So when I choose to spend my time and energy and love in an area, I want to dig up the roots from the most systemic place possible, because we don't have a lot of time, because there's people dying because of corporate power, and whatever solution that we choose needs to be full and systemic. So that's why I'm here. So I think that an element of democracy that feels particularly challenging these days is collaboration and listening. I don't know about you, but it feels really hard some days to listen to people, and it feels really hard to feel heard sometimes. So we're going to start out today by talking to each other for a few minutes. And I want you to turn to someone next to you. Some of you know each other, some of you don't, so talk to somebody new if you can. And I'm going to say a word, and I want you to turn to someone next to you and give them a few words that come to mind when I say that word, okay? So we're going to create a nice little stew of words here that we'll sit in tonight, okay? So the first word is democracy. What does that make you think of?
What was the first word?
The first word is democracy.
What do you think?
All right, make sure both people get a chance to share the few words that come to mind. Okay, let's go on to another word. This is a quick activity. We're going to talk about sovereignty. What does the word sovereignty make you think of?
Sovereign rights? There's sovereign.
What about the word community? Community. 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 Mhm. Okay. What about the word government? I just hear a lot of sighs. All right, here's the final word. Power. Okay. All right, so let's bring it back together. Thank you for humoring me with that. I think that it's really interesting to hear the associations that we have. I think that history is told in the euphemisms and in the catchphrases that we hear in history class, that we hear across generations. And so tonight I want to unpack some of those ideas and some of those words. By the way, a couple of themes that I heard. I heard people, I heard kings and presidents in terms of sovereignty. I heard some really good words that we're gonna stew in a little bit. So we're gonna do a very a quick history tonight. We're gonna zoom through time and space. Bear with me with that. I want to start by thinking about this idea that is present today, and that is that corporations are people. And I want to be clear before we talk about corporations that Move to Amend is not anti-corporate. That's a ludicrous idea, actually, right? A corporation is an ancient idea. It's a tool. Hating a corporation is like hating a hammer. A hammer can be used to build a house for someone who needs a house, and a hammer can be used to smash in someone's skull, right? It really just depends on how it's being employed. So when we're talking about corporations tonight, we're not talking about anyone who ever started an LLC. We're talking about mega corporations, transnational corporations that have unchecked power, and we're talking about the modern corporate form. So corporations are super old. It's an ancient tool. It's a Latin word that means to give body, to come together as body. Corporations have been used a long time ago to do lots of stuff. The Roman aqueducts were built by corporations. Lots of theaters and productions were put on. It hasn't always looked exactly how it looks today. So let's take this ludicrous idea that corporations are people, and let's run with that logic for a little bit. What are the features of a human person? Corporations don't have a belly button. We can't start there. They don't have a mother. We can't go there. But let's talk about the birth of the modern corporation. So let's take it back to the 15th century. We're at the late 1400s. It's a really interesting time in history, often referred to as what? The age of discovery, right? Age of exploration, right? That all sounds pretty good. Those are good words. I'm going to challenge that a little bit. I'm going to call this the age of exploitation, the age of colonization, the age of empire. A lot was going on during this time. You've got this group, small group, mind you, of rich, elite, white guys in Europe, and they're sitting there thinking, this is great. We're sending our ships all over the world, we're getting lots of resources, and this is working out for us. And we heard about this thing called the New World, new to us. And we think it would be really cool to explore that, but we're having this pesky little problem where people really don't like to be oppressed and stolen from. It's just this thing. So how can we possibly go about our mission without having all of the risk and liability that's associated with colonizing distant lands? So as greedy as these economic elites may have been, they were not stupid. And they knew that it's a powerful wedding when you can have economic elites and political elites together in the same room. Here's a hint. Whenever there's a secret meeting between political and economic elites, it's not going to go well for the common person. So they march down to the palace, knock on the door, and they say, hey, king friend, we have this idea. We want to keep making a lot of money, and we want to have very limited risk. And the king's sitting there thinking, things aren't going so well. He's having lavish parties, fighting lavish wars, and his treasury is not looking so hot. So he says, as kings do, I also want to make a lot of money, but I don't want to do a lot of work. This is also a thing. So he says, let me offer you something exciting here. I can offer you something called a corporate charter. And I'm going to sweeten the pot a little by including something called limited liability. So can anyone in here, without turning this into a law class, give us a very brief description of what limited liability is?
The liability stops with the form of the organization rather than transferring over to the person who began the organization.
Definitely. So it means that there's no risk beyond your initial investment. So if I want to start a company and I go to Karen and I say, hey, I need $10,000 to do my idea. She gives it to me, and I go off and accidentally spill 60 million barrels of oil in the Gulf of Mexico and kill 60 workers. And I come back and I say, Karen, we really messed up. We have a problem here. She can say, I just gave you the money. You got to figure that out on your own. So limited liability is a pretty sweet deal for someone who wants to make a whole lot of money and doesn't really want to put up the risk. So this appealed to the economic elites of the time, and they said, we'll take you up on that. So you've got this idea forming of this modern corporate form, and I want to go over some of these really basic components of the modern corporate form. The first is there are very limited consequences for actions because of limited liability. And this modern corporate form has the potential to incentivize irresponsibility and making it a perfect vehicle for mass colonization at the time when empires were really looking to expand worldwide. So it works out pretty well. I think we often hear of corporations as free market success stories. Who's heard that? Corporations are, the capitalist dream. They're making us money. But the reality is that corporations cannot exist without the legal, military, or political backing of the state. They are a creation of the state and a creature of law. And successful people's movements have recognized that power is not inevitable, but rather it's constructed. And I think that that's really good news. So I'm 27 years old, which means I've lived my entire life under extreme corporate capitalism. And it seems often like there's not a lot of hope for things to look different. It's really easy to think that this is just the way things are. However, this is not the way things are. This is the way things have been constructed. And the good thing about that news is that if power is constructed, that means we can deconstruct it and we can build something better. And that's what gets me out of bed every day. There's an important theme here that oppression, or tyranny, as our friends in the Revolutionary War may have said, is both political and economic. So if you want to create bad power over people, you really got to have both sides of that equation down. You need to have political and economic control. And if you have a movement that recognizes both sides, political and economic power, it's going to be much stronger than one that's just addressing one side of that equation. And a corporation is one of the most explicit examples of political and economic power working together. It's a very powerful machine. Again, it's a machine, so it has capacity to do good. However, when you have a profit motive attached, that changes the game a little bit. So here's a theme that we're going to explore a lot and hear a lot in history, and that is those in power organize to oppress and keep people under control, and those who are being oppressed organize to resist it. So we're going to speed ahead a little ways to the 13 original colonies. Question for you all, what was the most powerful corporation that existed at the time of the American Revolution? Anyone? Right, British East India Company. So the British East India Company was a powerhouse. Think of any transnational corporation you can think of now. It makes Walmart look like a toddler in diapers. The British East India Company controlled large swaths of the globe in corporate fiefdoms. It had a fleet of ships to rival the British Navy, and it had its own court system, because apparently elites don't like the same rules as we get to live by. And this is important because the British East India Company was strongly tied to the British government at this point, and most members of British Parliament owned stock in the British East India Company. So you have, I think this piece of information helps us to understand the colonial period a lot better, right? And also it sounds a little bit familiar, right? As a country who is dealing with extreme wedding of political and economic power at the very top of our government. So it wasn't that long ago that I was in school, and I remember a lot of stories about why we fought the American Revolution. I remember that we were sick of the king, we were sick of monarchy, and we were sick of taxation without what? Right. So the fact that everyone in this room knows that means that someone really wanted us to know that, right? And these stories are perpetrated very simply. These stories are told to us in a way that simplifies history and decreases the amount of information we get about the power of people. And that's very strategic, because who writes our textbooks? Corporations do, right? It's a really interesting movement about that if you haven't learned about that yet. So these were certainly some reasons we fought the American Revolution, but just like any war, people fight for a lot of different reasons. And I think it's important to consider that there were much more radical demands at the time of the American Revolution than just getting out from under the control of the king. So the British East India Company was just one of the corporations running around at this time doing their business. We've probably said the phrase 13 original colonies a million times, and it becomes a little stale, so I want to unpack this a little bit. What is a colony? It's a group of people from a different place occupying another place. It's under partial or total political control of another government, right? It's an occupation. So a colony in the United States was run much like a corporation. In fact, 12 of the original 13 colonies were at some point corporations. And they were chartered by the king to these wealthy elites to be run as a company. So you've got this governor who was running like a CEO, who was making a lot of profit, and again with this theme that people in power don't always like to do their own work, but they like other people to do it for them. So you've got these folks who are coming over to the United States at this time, some certainly for religious freedom, right? We hear that a lot. But a lot of people also came here on profit-making enterprises. And those are the stories we don't hear as much because they're not as bright and shiny. And the chartered colonies were highly tied to the British government still, being run as companies. And you've got these CEOs saying, I think we could find someone to do the work for us. So they start to bring people over to do the labor that's needed to run a colony for an empire. Empires like colonies, why?
Money.
Money, right? Raw materials, resources, land expansion, all of these things. But that's a lot of work. So who do they bring over to do this work? Indentured servants, debtors, orphans, Africans who they then enslaved, vagrants, which as far as I can tell, vagrancy is just being poor in public. Correct me if you know something I don't, but seems like that's what I can gather. So I want to make a point that these people, the founders of some of the original land that we now occupy, captured and displaced human beings and enslaved them to generate maximum profits for their corporation/government. That's a part of history that we need to take very seriously. So you've got all these folks, enslaved Africans, debtors, indentured servants, and I don't know about you, but I was always taught that this was a very submissive thing, that, why didn't these people say something? Why didn't they get out from under this power? But we don't hear the stories of all of the beautiful alliances made during this time and the uprisings and the attempts at freedom during this time. There were people who were resisting radically during this period of time. And these folks, they recognized something about power. They recognized that this governor/CEO was getting rich off their backs, that they were doing the work. They knew that power was both political and economic. And they knew that this CEO was making a lot of money and that this money was codified into law by those who invested in him. Does that sound familiar? Right. So, you've got the American Revolution heating up, you've got these folks in Boston who are calling for an end to taxation without representation and getting free from the king, and a lot of common folks had a good laugh about that, and they said, that's not going to solve the problem. I mean, that's all good, and we need those things, but there's a lot more that needs to be done here in order for us to be free people. So, some of the more radical demands of the American Revolution that we don't hear very often include full enfranchisement for all people, freedom, equality, and justice, which seem like buzzwords, but at the time were very revolutionary concepts. An end to slavery, even at this time, an end to foreclosures on small landowners in favor of plantations, an equal distribution of wealth and land to every person, the democratization of the military. People saw that as this new country was forming, the military was going to be something that the people needed to have a large say over. That was a demand. They were calling for the elimination of all debt and paper currency, a lot of other demands. And again, it's not that long ago that I was in school. I didn't hear about any of this because these things are radical. They're beyond what seems possible, but they were being demanded at this time. And then, of course, you have the indigenous people on this land who are saying, you are all illegitimate and get off our land, please. That's a whole different conversation. So I think that this helps us to understand the Boston Tea Party a little better, at least for me. I remember that when I was younger, I thought, okay, so you add tea to seawater and you get revolution? It seems a little simple, but that's the story I'm being told. But that's not the case. This was a well-constructed plan. People saw the connection that taxation of tea and other commodities was a mechanism of colonization that was brought to them by a union of the economic and political elite. They engaged in an act of nonviolent direct action against a dangerous wedding of corporation and government. The Boston Tea Party was an act of civil disobedience. I wonder what the Tea Partiers would have to say about that. I think that that's a really interesting concept when you think about it as resistance to corporate rule. So the American Revolution, I want to be clear, was both explicitly anti-monarchical and anti-corporate. And I'm saying this not to upset people who have a corporation, who say, I work for a corporation, it does good. I'm talking about the fact that the American revolutionaries had just seen takeover of the globe by corporate entities that were in relationship with the government, and they knew how dangerous a corporation could be in its large form. They saw that, they lived that, they fought a war about it. And so, the founding fathers had their problems, but they did know one thing, and that's that corporations had the potential to have extreme power in government, and that scared them. And you can read, this is a side thought, but you can read a speech that Abraham Lincoln gave long before he was president, where he talked about his concern for the Union, and he said, my concern for the Union is matched by my concern about corporate power. Abraham Lincoln talked about the dangers of corporate corruption way early on. Again, something that's conveniently erased from our history. So we fight this Revolutionary War. Mostly poor people fought the Revolutionary War. And once the common enemy was gone and the dust had sort of settled, folks began to look around, and a lot of the common people realized that maybe they didn't have as much in common with these wealthy merchants in Boston as they might have when they were fighting this war together. So there became sort of these divides that began to form. There was a lot of class tension at this time. And you've got these merchants and elites who come to the Congress of Confederation, and they said, I'm not sure that the trade agreements of this new nation are really going to suit us. Is it okay if we have a meeting and talk about that, maybe write up a couple things? And the Congress of Confederation said, well, you're rich and that sounds boring, so knock yourself out. So they got together in Philadelphia, they closed the door, and instead of writing what they said they would, what did they write? The Constitution. That was never supposed to come out of that meeting. Here we are. So, you've got this constitutional convention, this group of elites gathered together, and at the beginning of the meeting, they gave a series of speeches, and you can read these speeches. And it's clear to me that they were afraid of something that we often think they were very much not afraid of, and that's democracy. They were very willing and excited to get out from under the thumb of the king, but they were also right there to pounce on the power. They were right there to usurp the power that was just won in the American Revolution, these wealthy elites. So they were not so much about democracy, but more about power and money. They had speculations in Western lands, they had investments during the war that they wanted to see come to fruition, and they wanted to protect their property, because not many people owned property at that time, and they did. One historian calls the Constitutional Convention the first NAFTA, which was a gathering of the wealthiest people in the country behind closed doors to standardize trade across borders for the consolidation of wealth for the economic elite. Sounds about right, huh? So when this document came out, you've got all these people who need to ratify it. And these people had just fought a war, and they saw this document, and they said, no, I fought this war for sovereignty and justice, and this is nothing more than a property rights document. What is this? So what do we get? We get the Bill of Rights, right? So I remember, again, thinking how lazy and sloppy that you would leave that out the first time. You're not even talking about people in the original document. That's just so lazy. But actually, that was a very strategic and constructed way to do it. So the Bill of Rights came from a robust people's movement that was demanding actual rights for human beings codified in what would become the supreme law of this land. That's a big deal. So you've got the common people saying, no, that's not what happened. They enforce their power and they get the Bill of Rights. So when we talk about the things that we like about the Constitution, what do we talk about? Freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, freedom of religion, freedom to bear arms, all these good things. Guess what? Those aren't in the original Constitution. They're in the Bill of Rights. Those things that we like about the Constitution, that we know about the Constitution, came out of a robust people's movement for rights of human beings. And honestly, rights of human beings in a time where people saw that corporate power was threatening them in a very intense way. They also saw that they had just fought a war about it. So this was in a time of intense discussion about the power of political and economic elites. Okay, so we've got this relationship to consider between concentrated capital, corporate power, and democracy. And this is a theme all throughout history as well. So I want to talk about the words, we the people. I think that if a wonky person or a lawyer had gotten their hands on the Constitution, they might have said, let's make it say we the legal persons. What does it mean to be a legal person? What do people get? People get rights, right? We have rights. Rights that were won and fought for in bloody, bloody movements. But at the time the Constitution was written, who qualified as we the people? Rather, who didn't qualify? Women, people of color, people who didn't own land, right? Lots of people. Can we guess what percentage of, and of course indigenous people, can you give me a guess of what percentage of people living on this land at that time counted as we the people? 32%. 32? Any other guesses?
10.
10? 5 to 8%. Yeah. So probably no one in this room, right? None of us are we the people at this time. And there's something beyond rights that people get. When people are legally recognized as persons, they also get cultural legitimacy, right? It matters to us what the Constitution decides is a person. We know that because we know that women had to fight for our right, we know that African Americans had to fight for their rights, and we know that because of those rights, our culture has massively shifted, and that cultural shift wouldn't have happened without those amendments, and vice versa. Law and culture have a relationship like this. Law does not happen in a vacuum, right? It happens in our culture, and we decide where power lies and why certain entities have power. Again, power that can be deconstructed. So being a person is a very sacred thing to be, and I think we can say that from a lot of different perspectives. And you can take that to be whatever it means to you personally, spiritually. It matters to be a person. So, does anyone know what it takes to form a corporation in the state of Ohio? Does anyone here have a corporation in the state of Ohio?
No.
Okay, so you know.
Filing
Filing fee, right? You can do it online, I think, now. I checked it out before I came. It's like $250 maybe between the two fees. I've not done it, but I just checked it out. So it's pretty easy, right? Let's talk about what it used to take to form a corporation at the time that the Constitution was ratified. A person who wanted to start a corporation would have to submit their papers and their plan for the corporation to the lower house of the state. The lower house would look at it, and they would consider a series of requirements for this corporation. The corporation had to be serving the public good in some way. It had to have a mission that helped the community in which it was operating. The folks who owned the corporation had to live in the area where it was formed. It had a lifespan, generally around anywhere from 5 to 20 years, generally the average lifespan of a merchant at the time. It wasn't supposed to live past the initial person. There were no mergers allowed, and if it lived past its lifespan or made more money than it ever intended to make, it would be turned back over to public hands. The people had a lot of control over what corporations were doing and how they were operating. Also, until 1850, it was a felony for a corporation to contribute a single cent to a political campaign. Does that sound familiar? No. Okay, so we might do things a little differently now than we did at the time of the American Revolution. Hindsight's 20/20. But what we do know is that they understood the power the corporations could have, and there were a lot of instances at this time of people exercising real structural sovereignty. People saw the corporate problem, and they were forming community groups and creating policies and legislation that protected their communities and the sovereignty of their communities. And that's really important to us as Americans, right? We want to be the ones to decide if there's poison in our water, if our kids are allowed to go to school, if we go to war. We have all of these fundamental choices that we don't get to make about our communities, but we get to choose between Coke and Pepsi, and we think that's pretty cool. And I think it's important to recognize that consumer choices are not the same thing as democracy, and that there have been points in history in this country where people were actually exercising sovereignty. But that was a little claustrophobic for corporations. They saw that being a human being was pretty exciting and came with a lot of cool stuff. And they, not that there wasn't a good old boys club at this time, but there wasn't the institutionalized leverage. A corporation, a lobbyist couldn't come to a legislator and offer them an amount of money to decrease regulations on something because they wanted to get a project done. They didn't have a role that was codified in law. So they thought, maybe we should try this being a person thing. Seems pretty cool. But how could we make that happen? Because the American people are actually pretty smart about us, and they're looking out for us. So what branch of government would be best to start with to try to convince them to give us these powers that people have? And they thought, how about the judiciary? Why? Because it's a lot easier to get a group of 9 unelected, unaccountable Supreme Court justices to grant you something than all of the American people who have a say in the other branches of government. So they thought, let's talk to those guys. So slowly but surely, they drove themselves into the Constitution with a series of Supreme Court decisions that gave corporations the constitutional protections that human beings enjoy. And out of the long decades of struggle to insert themselves into the phrase, we the people, we then came to a very scary place where corporations don't have mouths, so if they're people, how do they talk? Money. And the Supreme Court then gave corporations the right to spend money as free speech. Now, if the phrase money is free speech isn't an oxymoron, I don't know what is. So what you have in the United States Constitution is a pretty good idea. And that idea is that there's two actors. There's we the people and there's government. We the people are supposed to be free and sovereign. And the United States government is supposed to be subordinate and accountable. We the people are supposed to have rights that are private. The United States government is supposed to have public duties to serve the public good. And we the people choose to delegate some of our power to the government to be subordinate and accountable to us to do our will. So if you think about the corporation and which side the corporation fits on, is it part of the we the people and the private side, or is it part of government creations and the public side? Well, it's a creation of law. It was always intended to be subordinate and accountable. So it seems pretty clear to me that that would go on the public side. But when you give a corporation the rights of a human being, you've bastardized the entire concept of how the Constitution was supposed to work. So with that in mind, I'd like to do a series. I'm going to do this interesting experiment here. There's not a lot of us, but I think it'll be fun. Fun in a depressing way. But what I'd like to do is see if we can actually get up, if you're able, and if we could like form a little group up here. I've got these cards. We're going to pass them out and we're going to read them. And these are the Supreme Court decisions that led us to the place we are, starting from where I left off. So if you wouldn't mind, let's get together. Okay. And we're going to get an order here.
Oh, I need glasses.
Okay.
Yeah, that might be a good idea. Glasses. My knees back.
Right. We've got two more timelines for them, so you don't have a card now, so I want to next. So we'll still stay standing because we're going to go through and do more. Okay, so 1886, you start. And we're each going to read these out loud in chronological order.
Santa Clara County versus Southern Pacific Railroad, 1886. Without any formal argument, the court declares a corporation a person with the same rights as human beings. They grant them the 14th Amendment right to equal protection that was supposed to protect recently emancipated black folks. Justices have since struck down hundreds of local, state, and federal laws enacted to protect people from corporate harm because these discriminate against corporations. All right.
Hale versus Henkel, 1906. Corporations get Fourth Amendment, search and seizure protections. Corporations use this right to demand the regulators get warrants before they can inspect businesses for violations of labor and environmental laws.
Yeah, the year I was born, 1919. Dodge versus Ford Motor Company. The Michigan Supreme Court rules that a corporation exists to maximize profits for its whole shareholders, regardless of the impacts on the planet, economy, or health and safety. This ruling mandates perpetual growth and practically guarantees human and environmental abuses.
I want to pause there for just a second. That's a big one, right? The Supreme Court said, as a corporation, you are legally bound to maximizing profits for your shareholders. What does that mean? That means there's going to be some cost somewhere. And where is that cost going to be? Human and environmental cost, right? That's a big one.
Lewis K. Liggett Company versus Lee, 1933. The people of Florida passed a law that levied higher taxes on chain stores than local businesses. The Supreme Court overturned because it discriminated against chain stores and therefore violated corporate 14th Amendment rights to equal protection.
So this happened in a community that I lived in. We passed a measure, it was a small community, really isolated, rural, heavily reliant on local economy. And we said, we don't want this Walmart to come into our town that's going to put business people out of business. So we passed this measure. They sued our county because they said, guess what? You can't discriminate against Walmart because we have 14th Amendment rights. So guess how many small businesses in Humboldt County were put out of business by that?
Which county is it?
Humboldt County, Northern California.
Buckley versus Dahlia, 1976. The Supreme Court rules that corporations have First Amendment rights to freedom of speech. Since corporations do not have mouths to speak with, the court rules that they speak by spending money in elections. This opened the door to a glut of corporate spending in the political process.
1977, First National Bank in Boston versus Aladdin. Corporations use their First Amendment rights to overturn state restrictions on corporate spending on political referenda. This precedent is used with Buckley versus Vallejo. The court attempts to remove corporate money from politics.
Pacific Gas and Electric Company versus Public Utilities Commission in 1986. Although PG&E has a monopoly on utilities in California, they refused to allow an advocacy group to use extra space on their billing envelope to encourage energy conservation. The court sided with PG&E, upholding the corporation's right not to speak and protecting what they call the corporation's freedom of mind.
The next chapter of that story, International Dairy Foods Association v. I'm going to say Amesjoy, 1996. Supreme Court overturns a Vermont law requiring the labeling of all products containing bovine growth hormone, citing the corporation's right not to speak and extending it to statements of fact as well as statements of opinion.
2010, Citizens United versus Federal Election Commission. Supreme Court reaffirms that a corporation is a person and states that any restrictions on corporate money in elections violates the corporation's First Amendment right to free speech. This ruling overturned most provisions of Kane-Feingold legislation that restricted corporate money in federal elections and reversed a 100-year precedent of congressional authority to regulate federal elections. Opens the floodgates to unlimited corporate spending in elections. $6 billion spent in the 2012 election cycle.
McCutcheon versus FTC 2014 struck down the aggregate limits on the amount an individual may contribute during a 2-year period to all federal candidates, parties, and political action committees combined.
Okay, so that helps us explain a little bit how corporations got their way into the Constitution, right? It's a slow process, a very strategic process. Okay, so thank you. Yeah, that would be great if we could collect those. So we're going to do another timeline now. Okay, this one, we've got a lot of cards on this one, so we might have to do two.
I would start with the people who didn't get it.
Yeah, let's start on that side. Move here.
While we're between, I'd just like to point out that I did not realize what all of these decisions are. They're called findings. The Supreme Court found this in the Constitution. Very interesting.
We're going to go around twice, so keep these in, first and second. So, Move to Amend is a unique organization. The amendment that we're working on to amend the Constitution one tool to get there. But what we believe is that there's no way that we can take on such heavy opposition and such a mighty task without building a strong and deep people's movement. We study in depth people's movement history. We study how people have made change. And we know that it takes an intergenerational movement. We know that it takes a multiracial, multi-ethnic movement to get this done. We know that there are people on the front lines who are fighting for their everyday survival from corporate power. And this timeline represents the ways that we, the people, have had to struggle in this country. It looks a little different from the corporate timeline. So let's get started. I think you have the first one.
Bill of Rights, 1791. The first 10 amendments to the U.S. Constitution were adopted to protect we the people from excesses of government. At this time, we the people, men and white males, who owned property and were 100 years old, only 58% of people in the U.S. counted as people and got the protections of the Constitution.
Plessy versus Ferguson, 1896. The Supreme Court ruled that state laws enforcing segregation by race are constitutional as separate accommodations of people. Black males effectively lost equal protection rights and access to the privileges of the white world.
Munger versus Pepperset, 1874. Women argued that the 14th Amendment Equal Protection Clause ensured their right to vote. The Supreme Court rejected their claims, stating that the 14th Amendment was only applied to black males.
U.S. Constitution, 1789. The writers of the Constitution were very interested in protecting their property and increasing their wealth. They wrote a founding document that protected property over people and removed the government from the will of the mob. Without using the words slave or slavery, they made slavery legal and institutionalized.
Act 10. Okay, Act 10, 1639. This Virginia colony statute grants the privilege of armament to all white men, including indentured servants, but excludes black men.
So I'm going to pause here. Obviously, my cards are a little out of the order, but that's okay. Still makes the point. And this one's a really important one because when we're considering what it means to be a person, we have to consider the struggle that actual people have had in this country to gain their own personhood and how easy that is compared to how corporations have gained personhood. And this act is important because it was a very strategic division of people. When I said we had all of this common people who were coming together to fight these economic elites, that wasn't going to work for them. So they needed to have some way to divide us. So what they said is, okay, well, you're all kind of out of luck, but you people are going to be called not slaves, but indentured servants. That sounds a little better. And we're going to give you a couple things to make you feel like you're a little more special than these other people. So what they did was they created race. Before that, there had been a lot of othering in the world, based on religion, based on a lot of other things. This was a moment in our history where we created race in this country. And that's what divided us, and that's what has kept us from recognizing our power in so many moments in our history.
At least you're not them.
Right, at least you're not them. Okay.
Act 7, 1668. Negro women not exempted from tax. Virginia colony law declares free English and free Negro women will be equally taxed, but Negro women will still be without rights.
Taxation from representation.
Still, they'll still be taxed. They won't have rights, but they'll be.
An act for preventing Negro insurrection. Acts, is it 20? Acts? So 10, 1680. Blacks are banned from carrying weapons of any kind, and if they presume to physically resist any Christian, they will be punished with 30 lashes on his bare back, well laid on. Blacks could also be legally murdered if they were found lurking in obscure places, the hoarded labor.
Slave inserted codes 1680 to 1705 established the term slave as equivalent to Negro, while servant now refers only to non-blacks or white persons. Slaves can be accidentally killed by their masters without penalty and are slaves for life along with all their children. In contrast, servants are granted new protections and privileges, including the right to take their master to court, the right to marry an under-European immigrant, and the guarantee of a severance pay and plot of land freed from service. White-black marriage is banned, and interracial sex is banned. Maybe black will tell those black interracial, yeah, that's right.
The Naturalization Act 1790. Immigrants are allowed to become citizens, but only if white. Without citizenship, non-whites cannot vote, own property, file lawsuits, or testify in court.
Just reading now. Indian Removal Act of 1830. Indigenous people are forced from their homelands east of the Mississippi River. Over 10 years, approximately 100,000 native children and adults marched thousands of miles west into unknown desert territory. 15,000 people died along the way.
1831, Cherokee Nation versus State of Georgia. A Cherokee delegation sues the state of Georgia for stripping their people of land and rights, but the court rules that they are a domestic dependent nation, unable to claim status in court, validating Cherokee removal and state seizure of their land.
The People versus Hall, 1854. Non-whites are barred from testifying in court. California Supreme Court reverses murder conviction of a white man, dismissing the testimony of a key Chinese witness stating that, quote, no black or mulatto person or Indian shall be allowed to give evidence in favor of or against a white man, quote.
Dred Scott v. Sanford, 1857. A slave sues his owner for freedom in a state where slavery is banned. The U.S. Supreme Court rules that Negroes are not U.S. citizens under any circumstance and have no rights which any white man is bound to respect. Free blacks are taxed like whites, but receive none of the rights and protections of citizenship.
Homestead Act, 1862. 50 million acres of formerly indigenous land in the West, seized by U.S. invasion in violation of treaties, is distributed by the government at low cost to white settlers only. An additional 100 million acres of land are given for free to railroad developers.
Chinese Exclusion Act, 1882, bans immigration of both skilled and unskilled Chinese laborers. This act is expanded in 1924 to restrict other Asian immigrants and ban Chinese white marriages in California.
The Dawes Land Allotment Act, 1887, forbids communal land ownership by indigenous people and encourages native people to sell their land to whites, breaks up collectively owned native lands, and redistributes millions of acres as property to white squatters.
Johnson-Reed Act 1924 creates immigration quota system based on the national origin, favoring Nordics from Northern and Western Europe over the inferior races of Asia and Southern and Eastern Europe.
The National Housing Act, 1934. Following the Great Depression, a federal housing authority is created to provide loans for home ownership, but the FHA standards discriminate against non-whites and deter investment in non-white communities. Known as redlining, this practice boosts the economic value of white neighborhoods relative to non-white neighborhoods.
Labor Relations Act 1935. Militant workers win the right to unionize, but white labor leaders compromise with Congress to exclude domestic and agricultural workers who are mostly black, Chicana, and Chinese. Because most labor unions also exclude non-whites from membership, this effectively amounts to labor rights for white men only.
workforce of certain industries, excluding domestic and agricultural workers, who are mostly non-white.
Japanese American internment, 1942, forces all Japanese American and Japanese residents living on the west coast of the U.S. into unsanitary, fenced concentration camps called war relocation camps. Over 111,000 people are interned, 62% of them American citizens.
GI Bill 1944, the Servicemen's Readjustment Act, offers education and housing subsidies to returning war veterans, but severe social discrimination, poverty, and lack of education prevents black veterans from receiving these benefits, while white veterans benefit disproportionately.
War on drugs, 1971. President Richard Nixon declares a war on drugs, which disproportionately and violently targets economically impoverished communities of color for the next 40 years, leading to mass incarceration for drug-related offenses. White populations are relatively unaffected.
Three strikes laws, 1994. 26 states passed mandatory minimum sentencing laws that require jail time for first and second offenses, and life in prison for crime as petty as stealing a pair of gym socks, shoplifting a pair of baby shoes, and stealing a slice of pizza. In my home state of California, blacks make up only 9% of the population, but 45% of those are convicted of a third strike.
And some people get Narcan 3 times in a day and don't see jail.
Post 9/11 disappearances. Immediately following the attacks on New York City, thousands of Arab, Muslim, and South Asian men living in the U.S. cities are snatched from their homes, places of work, and off sidewalks by federal agents without warrants or charges. Shackled hand and foot, detained and prevented by the Federal Bureau of Prisons from contacting family, press, or attorneys. Many were held for months in abusive conditions. Now, one of these thousands has never been publicly charged with terrorism.
I think it was
9/11.
How many thousand?
9/11.
Or how many thousand? Did it say?
It just says these thousands.
This is 2002, National Security Entry Exit Registration System, 202. NCERS, which is the National Security Entry Exit Registration, mandates that all nationals over the age of 15 from 25 specific countries, all of them Arab or Muslim, apart from North Korea, report to the government to be fingerprinted, photographed, and questioned as part of a special registration program. People were given no individual notice of these requirements, but if they failed to register, they could be deported or charged with criminal offenses.
Arizona Senate Bill 1070 in the year 2010. Police are required to ask individuals to present their citizenship or immigration documents if they have undefined, quote, reasonable suspicion, quote, that a person stopped might be in Arizona illegally, justifying racial profiling and harassment.
And a year later, the Alabama House Bill 56 in 2011. In addition to police, school administrators at the high school, middle school, and elementary levels are required to demand citizenship or immigration documents for any child whom they reasonably suspect is living in Alabama illegally. Children are racially singled out in classrooms in front of their peers and handed papers from their teachers demanding to see immigration or citizenship documents.
Yeah. I think this is Giuliani. NYPD stop and frisk 2011. The 2011 New York City's discriminatory stop and frisk program continues to escalate with over 680,000 public police stops made on the street, and 84% of those
exercise is to demonstrate how easy it was for corporations to insert themselves into the Constitution and to get rights. That wasn't a very long timeline, right? The longer timeline is the struggle that people have been through, human beings, to ensure the same rights as these corporate entities, these fictional creations of the law. Real human beings went through all of that. Corporations didn't face violence, they didn't face deportation, internment. Human beings did. And what's important to note is that being a person, personhood is sacred. And we cannot talk about legal personhood of corporations and unions and nonprofits without talking about the history, the complex history of personhood in this country. So before we close, I'm going to tell you a little bit more hopeful timeline, one that we're a part of. Bill of Rights, 1791. Outraged revolutionaries reject the Constitution as an elite property document and refuse to ratify it unless it contains basic political protections against the tyranny of the state. Their struggle is successful, and they drive through 10 amendments to the Constitution that protect people's rights to freedom of speech, assembly, religion, and the press, as well as others. 13th Amendment. Slavery is abolished in the U.S. and any place subject to its jurisdiction, 1865. 14th Amendment, 1868. Black males are now citizens. The law cannot discriminate against them in any way. 15th Amendment, 1870. Black males get the right to vote. 17th Amendment, 1913. The U.S. Senate is now elected by the people instead of appointed by state governments. 19th Amendment, 1920. Women finally get to vote after 75 years of struggle. Yeah. Brown versus Board of Education of Topeka, 1954. The Supreme Court recognizes that separation was not equal and ruled that public schools cannot be racially segregated. 24th Amendment, 1964. Abolished poll taxes, which were used to keep blacks and others from voting in some states. 26th Amendment, 1971. Voting age changed from 21 to 18 years of age, passed to recognize that if 18-year-olds could be drafted into military service, they should be allowed to vote. Roe v. Wade, 1973. The Supreme Court rules that statutes against abortions are vague and infringe on a woman's 9th and 14th Amendment rights to privacy. Abortion is legalized in the first trimester of pregnancy. We the People Amendment, 28th Amendment, 20-something. Artificial entities do not have constitutional rights, and money is not free speech. Campaign spending can be regulated. Sounds pretty good, right? Yeah. So here's the deal. We've got a long history of people fighting for their power, people driving themselves into the Constitution, people fighting for the right to be we the people. And at the same time, you have these artificial entities that are creations of the government who are given, handed personhood. We have to think about that as we build a movement for democracy. And what does it mean to have democracy? It means that everyone has a spot at the table. At Move to Amend, we think of democracy not as a noun and not as something that you get, but as something that you practice. Democracy is a verb, and in order to practice democracy, everyone has to have access to the political process. So this fight for the 28th Amendment is so much bigger than passing an amendment. It's about creating democracy, and it's about recognizing our history and being part of the hopeful history that's to come. Corporations, unions, nonprofits, artificial entities are not human beings. Money is not free speech. Am I right?
Yes.
Right. So here's what you can do. Move to Amend has chapters all over the country, about 50 chapters. We have 500,000 people. We have over 700 communities and 19 states who have passed the language of our amendment to state that corporations should not be people, money is not speech. Polling is at 80%. I study political science. I can't think of anything else that polls at 80%. There's a lot of things that we disagree about as people who live on this land. One thing that we can't agree about is that we need sovereignty and we need the capacity to make decisions for ourselves and our communities. That's what Move to Amend's doing. And there's an effort here in Greater Cincinnati that's doing that. This is a grassroots movement. We have a bill in the House of Representatives, has 54 co-sponsors. We're getting it introduced in the Senate this year. It's moving on that level, but really where the power is at the grassroots. It's with you all being here in this church sanctuary tonight and doing this town hall populist style movement building work that we're doing. And the folks here in Cincinnati are doing it really well. So I invite you to be part of this movement. There's so much work to be done, and whatever it is that gets you going, there's a place to use it in the movement. We say, get in where you fit in. Maybe you're a writer, maybe you're a teacher or an artist or a lawyer or a business owner. There's room for you here and we want you. So I want to thank you for taking the time to be here. And I also want to ask, tonight that we recognize that the influence of big money is a really hard thing to fight against without any money. And I invite you tonight to make an investment in this movement. Move to Amend does not take money from large foundations. We don't get money from any corporate sponsors, certainly. We're financed by small donors. Our average donation is $60. You can see exactly where we spend our money. You can see exactly where that money goes in funding the movement. The movement may not be televised, but it has to be funded. And so I want to invite you tonight to make a donation to Move to Amend to help this work happen, and I want to invite you to do the work on the ground here, making democracy happen, and join the local Move to Amend Cincinnati group. Thank you so much for being here, and I would love to, I don't know if we have time, I know we went a little over, if we have time for questions, that'd be great. Yeah? Okay. Are there any questions, anything anyone wants to talk about?
Let's just say, if anybody needs to go, please feel free to do so.
Of course. Yeah.
Quickly, Monsanto, have you read the book Whitewash?
I haven't, but I've heard of it.
Yes, they've known cancer, corruption of science, they've known since the 70s, when George Herbert Walker Bush said to Monsanto, sure, put it on my desk, I'll zip it through. It causes tumors in rats, and cancer is the number one killer for our kids today, and obesity and arthritis and everything is skyrocketing. And didn't Bayer just get approval to merge with Monsanto or something?
I hadn't heard that, but that's a big deal if it's true.
There's a couple of biggies there. German company Bayer, you know, has made the gas for the gas chambers and stuff. And donate 80-90% of corn, wheat, and soy from the United States of America, and don't eat the animals that eat that stuff. Do non-GMO organic or grow it yourself. It's unbelievable. And Portland, everybody's paid off by Monsanto.
Thank you for bringing up Monsanto. That wouldn't have a
Very timely.
Yeah, very timely. Yeah, we had that fight in California, but corporations have a right not to speak, so that means they don't have to tell us what's in our food, actually.
Well, like the Dark Act in Vermont.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, very relevant. Thank you. Yeah.
I'm curious what you think. It's not legislation, but Reverend Barber talks a lot about in the New Deal and how corporations didn't like what the New Deal was doing to them, so they tried to influence and say capitalism's great, but nobody was buying it. So they outsourced their message to the theologians, and certain ministries took up the call and said, and that's where we got our culture of if you're poor, you've done something bad, and if you are rich, you are good. And so I feel, it's not legislation, but it played an immense role in changing our culture to what it is today, and is responsible for the disparity. And it was corporations that did that. So it's another way that the culture has been changed, and our history has been changed, and allowed all of those things to happen because of that mentality. And I'm just curious where your thoughts are.
Yeah, I mean, I think that sounds right in line with everything that happened tonight. I mean, the corporate culture, the corporate capitalist culture you're talking about is such a stronghold, right? And I can't remember what the card was, but we talked about how there are consequences for not doing labor all the time, right? There's a strong culture of maximizing profit. Wonder where that came from. And yeah, if you're poor, you've done something wrong. If you have a lot of money, that's related to moral superiority somehow. That's all a function of corporate capitalism. Absolutely. Yeah, thank you for saying that. Anybody else? Okay, movetoamend.org. There's more there than you could ever try to read. Lots of information, lots of history, this very timeline. And thank you so much for being here. Yes, Karen.
So I just wanted to thank you all again for coming. Deb, who is getting ready to run the camera again. Dick, driver Mike, and our friend. James was here, he just left, Dick and I, and a couple of other people. Less than a year ago, we started the Greater Cincinnati Move to Amend. I think you can see just from the way this legislation has evolved that as long as these large dollar donations carry with them influence over our legislators, we are not going to resolve any of our problems. So as part of our grassroots campaign, we have petitions. If you've not signed one and you'd like to, we have some in the back. And we would ask that you sign. There's also at the bottom of each area where you put your name and address. There, if you want to just keep in touch with what we're doing or get involved in other ways, you can circle different events and we invite you to do that. And finally, if you pick one of these up, these are things you can do, like simply going online onto our Facebook page and liking and sharing. And also hand these to your friends and family and ask them to do the same thing. And you can actually go online to sign the petition, as can your family and friends. What's more, you can send letters to your congressman asking them to support Move to Amend. So thank you very much for coming.
And just a couple of things. There are other things that you can do, and they're not a huge ask. You can ask all your candidates to take the pledge to amend the Constitution. They can do that online. You can ask your organizations. Karen and I are members of Harmony right next door. We rent from, and by the way, they gave us the sanctuary free of charge. They're good people and have been very supportive. You can take any organization and have them endorse House Joint Resolution 48. That is the current introduced legislation. And that's one of the things you might want to watch because it's really the legislation that we support. Some people will get confused and say, we're only asking for support of Move to Amend. Yes, we are, but it's the resolution to amend the Constitution. And please sign the petition.
Thanks so much, everybody. Hi, thanks so much for being here.
Nice seeing you.
Thanks for putting it together. That was good.
I'm not either. I'm like, I'm in the faces. Good.
Yep.
Yes, yes.
All of you go home and buy a politician.
No, I was talking to my friends. Oh, yeah. It is. I just He's helping out.
Thank you.
All right, well, we'll see you again. Okay, take care.
Bye, Carol. Good to see you again.
Thank you very much. Thank you so much for being here.
If you want to get into the nitty gritty, I'll give you my, this is, yes, it's on the website.
I could send it to the mail. Thank you so much. Thank you so much.
It's really powerful when you go around and read them. Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. Those bastards. They're doing what they're doing.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Have a great day.
Should have been 40,000 people here.
Next time.
Oh, I tell you what, I do so much out here in the
Well,
and I hear from them.
we had 8.
Wow.
And it really keeps me from killing myself every day.
See, I don't have that issue. I know what it does. I just go and see. But then, you know,
I think the contact must have been like the opposite.
Okay, how do we turn it off?
On the website, you have to go big, that it's going to take a little longer. And, but they asked, so I was positioned, and they said, well, clearly, this is speech. And so, yes, and I looked back and said, oh, well, you're right. I mean, a non-charging job is very critical. What is that? It's all true. Yeah. So I don't know.
How's your book? Good. You don't look too happy to be here. I can understand that. If that's true, you probably would rather be home. Right? That's okay. That's okay. Would you do me a favor? See that little thing down there on the floor? It's the first up against that post there. Can you set that back the way it goes? Got it? The won't fasten or anything, I think it just sets in place. Yeah, it didn't stay in place, so it probably isn't going to stay in place for Get it close.
Anger towards the voice and
We'll see. I don't know. I didn't get through it. I was asking a question on it, but I didn't talk to her, so it's like,
they were like baby questions. I mean, for us.
So I didn't know. It wasn't that easy. And then they apologized
I
after.
forgot your name. Sam? Thank you for your help.
So she didn't really have to.
Okay, that's the whole, and I didn't really search for that enough.
This is for her, so I don't know.
It's to, kind of like shock everybody and we can go see. How was it?
Maybe a.
This is pretty powerful. We spent,
That would be, they would
both
do that.
doing this stuff and then still localized, but yeah, it's actually.
And yet,
You know who you did?
It's like,
John Pepper. John Pepper.
we can't
Wow,
go,
John
hey,
Pepper's
what's
the
your
CEO,
minute?
right.
But we can stand there with you and say, we support all the things like that.
Yes, and he's,
And then you could,
he is actually left. So, and he would love to learn about this. And he's Dave Pepper's dad.
And how they are. And if you turn that around.
I don't know him well, but I can say, hey,
and that's why we're,
you know, even if he won't be able to do it himself, he should be able to do it. Probably, you know, who you really want is you want a corporate attorney from the
Tell their story.
who's left.
Yeah.
For less.
Yeah, this is really sad. What you're actually representing. So that's what corporations do, they represent it, they can't speak to one person.
So you want corporate to say, yep, that's, yes, what she said, yep, that's exactly. Remember, I worked at P&G, and I was very held to the standard of having to make profit. That stakeholder discussion got started.
Do you know what that's going to look like yet?
Do you know that?
Usually it's
That's what I
very
did.
similar to the mix.
Yeah, we weren't, when people said stakeholder, you know, employment, I said, that is not your job. Your job is not to enhance the lives of the world's consumers. Your job is to make money for the shareholders. That's your job. Yeah, it's your only job.
So we have a lot of physical bodies. Yeah.
You can argue about whether doing this is short-term profits or long-term profits. We can have that
I think the
discussion.
board decided unanimously to support the golden cane. I just
We
wanted
can
to
have that dialogue, but
Yeah, but to, because,
that's not the same same thing as stakeholder.
And I think that we just need to do that. Yeah, but if not, I'll circle back to it.
Hey, excuse me, Deb. You didn't turn this off by any chance, did you?
I didn't. I figured I didn't know when you'd want to end it, and you can always stop it and ignore the end. Because yeah.
Do we know how to turn it off?
You can ignore the end, because just erase the end. Just erase the end.
So yeah, I think you probably do want to get someone who set is goes. Of course, that's our job.
Absolutely.